So I'm sure if you spend a decent time on my channel, you probably already know that I'm a huge fan of Final Fantasy XVI. I actually really like the game, despite it getting a lot of heat and a lot of hate because of the change of mechanics for this game. However, I truly enjoy the game and I spent a lot of time playing through this game, and it really has me excited for the future of Final Fantasy, which might not be too far off, despite Square Enix consistently telling us that they had no plans for a DLC for Final Fantasy XVI. It seems they left a lot of windows open for that possibility. And that's what I want to focus on with this episode of Nerd Space. I want to dive down into Final Fantasy XVI and give you guys my opinions about what could possibly be DLC for this game. So my name is Ruben with Nerd Space Games, and here are my top 7 ideas and concepts for DLC for Final Fantasy XVI. Also, before we jump into today's video, I want to let you guys know, because we are going to be talking about story details and following up on the story after Final Fantasy XVI, of course that means we are going to dive down into spoiler territory. So if you have yet to beat Final Fantasy XVI and you want to keep yourself spoiler free, maybe hold back on watching this video until you finish the game. But without further ado, let's get it. Number 7, Joshua's time gaps. As I said on a different video regarding unanswered questions and unsolved mysteries of Final Fantasy XVI, one of the biggest unknown details about Final Fantasy XVI actually goes back to Joshua, because we get the first time jump after the incident at Phoenix Gate, and that time jump goes 13 years into the future. Then we get yet another time jump after the first Mother Crystal is destroyed, and that time jump is 5 years. So that's a total of 18 years that's completely unaccounted for when it comes to Joshua. And we kind of have a hint to a lot of different characters about what they've been doing during those 18 years. However, the character that we don't know very much about and what they've been doing for so long is Joshua. Because after the incident at Phoenix Gate, he goes missing for 13 years. And we learned that he's kind of been researching and learning more about Ultima, and that is still apparently the case for the second time jump. So that means Joshua spent 18 years researching Ultima and visiting like so many different shrines and ruins to learn more about this character. And that, to me, in my opinion, seems like a lot of story to tell, because we can see Joshua in a DLC exploring different ruins, going to different lands to learn more about these fallen people and about Ultima and learning the story behind it, because it seems like Joshua and the Undying both have a lot of knowledge about Ultima by the time we finally meet up with them and we're reunited with Joshua. But to me, I think one of the most important stories to tell with Final Fantasy XVI when we're talking about Joshua is his relationship with Jote and the rest of the Undying, because I feel like there's more story to tell there. You can see that Jote and Joshua have a strong connection. And to explore that a little bit more, if we can get the same treatment that we got with Jill and Clive, but with Joshua and Jote, I think that is extremely valuable for the players of the franchise and people that really enjoyed the little tease moments that we got between those two. And we can see that play out more in DLC content. So I definitely think Joshua could very well get his own DLC content relating to his time gaps. If they wanted to take it a step farther, they can maybe explore it after the end of Final Fantasy XVI and maybe reveal to us that Joshua is still alive and kind of show what he does after the events of Final Fantasy XVI. But more than likely, I think based off of how they left it, if they are going to explore Joshua more, it will probably be flashbacks during those time gaps. Number 6, Dion's redemption. So I consider Dion part of the big 3. And what I mean by that is that there are 3 characters that are completely left as a mystery as to if they actually died or survived the events of Final Fantasy XVI. Of course, we have Clive, the main character, and I already mentioned Joshua, but the one other character that is kind of left up for debate as to if he actually survived or not is Dion himself. And as the Prince of Sabrek, who's also responsible for destroying an entire city within his own empire, there is a lot of story to tell with Dion, and there's so much more that we can see explored going past Final Fantasy XVI's ending. So of course, if Dion is going to get his own DLC content, we first have to assume that Dion survived the events of Final Fantasy XVI. That the final battle, Dion walked away still alive. Which isn't that much of a stretch. I won't dive too much into it because I have a whole video talking about how Dion could have survived that incident. I'll leave that at the end of this video. But the fact of the matter is, there is a possibility he could have easily survived the final battle. And if he did, we could easily see DLC on this character because there is definitely some more story bits that we can see with Dion. Specifically, maybe his relationship to both Terrence and the little girl that we keep seeing throughout Final Fantasy XVI. One issue I had with the game that I didn't mention in any other video is that this one character seemed to have been introduced, but they never do anything with this character, and that is the little girl who has the healing potions. We first see her interacting with Joshua as he is bleeding out from holding Ultima inside of him, and then we also see her again trying to help and save Dion, and actually succeeds in helping Dion survive. So between those incidents, it seems like that this character has an extreme amount of importance for the story. And because Final Fantasy XVI ended the way it did, the only way I can see her character explored a little bit more is if there's DLC content following Dion as he survives the final battle and he's picked up by both Terrence and the girl. And it does kind of make sense because the final battle actually takes place right above the town of Twinside, which is right around the corner from where the little girl and Terrence were last to be seen at. So it is very possible that they could be in the area, they maybe find Dion wash up on shore somewhere, and then they pull him aside and heal him back to health. And then we have a story kind of exploring a little bit more with those characters. Maybe they go on a journey to find a new home somewhere else away from the Empire. That way Dion doesn't have to deal with his sins against the Empire. Or we could actually see it explored a little bit more in terms of Dion trying to rebuild the Empire. Either way, with so many different story beats to kind of explore with Dion and the little girl, I feel like it could very well be a possibility that we see DLC content exploring more of Dion's story and potentially giving him the redemption that he deserves. Number 5, traveling with Mid. So I guess I want to start off by saying that I don't think he will play as Mid in a DLC. I just feel like as great of a character as Mid is, she doesn't seem like a playable type character protagonist in my opinion. However, I can definitely see the player playing alongside Mid as she goes on a journey across to different countries and continents around Valisthea. Because all we've seen so far is Valisthea. We haven't seen anything outside of Valisthea in this Final Fantasy XVI world. And we know other continents exist, and actually apparently Mid and Cid are both from outside of Valisthea, and Mid specifically has more of a story to tell. So we know very little about Mid's backstory, and most of that is thanks to the lore details that we get throughout the game. But basically all we know about Mid is that she really wants to travel around the world because she had this dream along with Cid, and she wants to travel around the world. Also, we know Cid adopted her after the death of her parents during some great war, which definitely explains why Mid is so against her inventions being used for war. Outside of that, we don't really know too much more about Mid, which is exactly why I think exploring her backstory a little bit more can give us more insight on a character who was extremely popular to a lot of fans throughout this game. Now, I did mention that I don't think you will play as Mid. However, I do see the player joining Mid on her travel on her boat around the world. And the only characters that kind of make sense for who can join Mid would be Jill, Joshua, or maybe Dion, potentially Clive. But I feel like the most likely option is probably either Jill or Joshua, because Clive, in my opinion, I feel like he truly is dead. And with Dion having his own story to resolve with the little girl and Terrence, I feel like the two likely candidates are Joshua, who I believe truly survived, and Jill, who of course we absolutely know did survive the events of the final battle of Final Fantasy XVI. So between those two characters, I can see one of them or both of them joining Mid as she travels around the world to visit new continents and meet new people. And that could be a really expansive DLC release for Final Fantasy XVI. If that's what we get, more than likely it will probably be a couple years before we see that, since a DLC with that magnitude definitely seems like it's gonna be a pretty massive update for the game, and it's gonna take time, especially since, according to Square Enix, they haven't worked on any kind of DLC for this game yet, so who knows. Number 4, the story of Cid. So I kind of touched a little bit on it when I was talking about Mid. However, there's another character that is from outside of Valisthea who we don't know too much about, and that is Cid himself. So if you remember, Cid actually passed away early on in the game of Final Fantasy XVI. I would say probably the first 20% of the game is when you lose Cid, which actually was a huge punch to the gut because Cid was actually a really interesting character that I felt like a lot of us fans really enjoyed, and it was sad that we didn't get to see his wise ass bickering a little bit longer throughout the story. However, because we lost him so early, it leads me to believe that maybe we might see a little bit of Cid and some DLC content. And there is a lot of backstory to tell with Cid. The first and foremost thing you can focus on when it comes to Cid is the fact that he's from outside Valisthea. We can show how he finds his way to Valisthea. And what's more interesting about his journey to coming to Valisthea is that I believe he actually meets both Benedicta and Barnabas before Valisthea. So before Valisthea, before he even came to the continent of Valisthea, he had already had a relationship with both Benedicta and Barnabas. So there's 3 different characters we can kind of explore with Cid's backstory alone. Also, we can show how Cid came across Mid and what happened to her parents, because yes, we know that apparently Mid's parents died during war, but we don't really know the details of that and how that happened exactly. And we also don't know how Cid came across Mid and how he adopted her. So there's some story elements that we're missing there that would be really cool to explore and see how that played out. Not to mention, I already touched on it a little bit, but Benedicta and Barnabas are some really interesting, mysterious characters of Final Fantasy XVI, that learning more about Cid's relationship with both of them and why he felt he could trust them and went along with their dreams for so long would be an interesting story to tell. Maybe we can actually see some lighter tones and moments from Barnabas and Benedicta and kind of explore that relationship between that triangle, because honestly that'd be a really cool story to see, especially since it kind of could easily be turned into a love triangle near the end, and could be pretty dramatic to see play out how Cid walks away from both Benedicta and Barnabas because he was disgusted of Benedicta's lust for power and Barnabas's brutality. So it's a really cool story and backstory that we can see. There's some more elements that we can see how he started the rebellion and how he met all these different peoples. We've seen little tad bits of it and some of his relationships with some of these characters, like with Otto and Karen, but it would be really cool to see that explored a little bit more. So I think Cid is a very interesting character with a very lengthy backstory that could easily work for DLC content. Number 3, the history of Barnabas Tharmr. So personally, the character I found the most interesting about Final Fantasy XVI and that I wish we explored so much more is not Cid and it's not Mid, it is 100% Barnabas. I feel like Barnabas has the most interesting backstory and has so much story to tell, and I wish we got to dive down into that just a little bit more. And yeah, I get it, I know he's the bad guy, but I feel like a character like him wasn't always like this. When you think about it, he was coming from a good place. He was doing something that he thought was going to save the entire human race. And that's what's really, really sad, because he had such a noble motive, but he went about it completely the wrong way. So it's really tragic to see a character who seemed to have a lot of care and love for the human race do so much harm to the human race. And I feel like it's such an interesting tale to tell, to explore how did Barnabas get to this point. So what we know about Barnabas and his mother is the fact that they are actually descendants of the Fallen. And if you don't know who the Fallen is, that's okay, because the Fallen's not really explored much unless you read some of the lore details. Basically, all we know about the Fallen is that it was a race of human beings that lived up high in the air. And because they got obsessed with magic and they lost faith in their god, ultimately it led to their downfall, and their lust for magic is what pretty much killed the race, as their kingdom came crashing down. And that's why you see all the different ruins around Valisthea. Well, some of the Fallen actually survived, those that were huge worshippers of Ultima. And that's where we find Barnabas and his mother, as they are both descendants of fallen people who worshipped Ultima. And we know that they were apparently somewhere outside of Valisthea for a long time. They grew up outside of Valisthea. and then ultimately one day Barnabas come over to Waloed, and just like that, Barnabas becomes king of Waloed. We don't know the story or backstory how he managed to do it and how he became king. We know might have had something to do with his powers as Odin, being Odin's dominant. But other than that, that's not really explored that much. We don't know Barnabas's backstory. We don't know much about his mother. We don't know anything. We don't know how he managed to convince both Benedicta and even Sid to follow him. There's so much story to tell there, and kind of exploring why he has this so completely undying faith in Ultima and is willing to sacrifice the human race with the thought that maybe they will all be brought to paradise after doing this. I don't understand it at all, and I think having a full DLC devoted to his character and his backstory and exploring that relationship he had with Ultima would be extremely helpful to understand more about his character. Number 2, Torgal's journey. I am going to be completely honest here. I know this is a pipe dream. I know this is probably not going to happen at all. But come on. Wouldn't you love it if you can just have a full DLC campaign where you play as Torgal? That would be one badass DLC in my opinion. Maybe it's just because of my love for dogs. So I guess I should explain myself and kind of explain how this would work. If Square Enix really did consider the idea of it, I don't think they would, but hey, you know, let me just lay this out on the table, and maybe Square Enix one day will potentially give us something like this. But Torgal, in my opinion, is probably the best character and the most interesting, lovable, and likable character in Final Fantasy XVI. And yes, I am biased because I love dogs. But truly, this character, Torgal, he is the most loyal and faithful pup to Clive and the Rossfield family and Jill and all of them. He's extremely fierce, he's extremely devoted, and he would do anything to protect his masters. And I absolutely adore that. But what I can see being maybe as a fun, small little playable segment for a DLC is just showing Torgal's journey during those 13 years that he was missing. Because all we know is that Torgal pretty much disappeared around the time that Jill was captured. And that was 13 years right around the time of Phoenix Gate. And then we see him reunite with Clive, and that apparently he's been with Sid for a pretty long time. That's pretty much all we know about it. But what really tugs at my heart and what really shows that there is kind of an interesting story to tell here is that side quest that we get inside Final Fantasy XVI, and that is more than words. It shows how Torgal has completely been searching for Clive, Jill, and all of his masters for all of this time. For that entire 13 years, he was consistently trying to find them, and he did everything he could. He would find small items that smell like them, and he would keep them in the treehouse, and it was just such a beautiful story to learn about. And yeah, having a small little playable segment as Torgal sounds pretty badass. Again, I don't know if I should have this as number 2. This probably should be like number 7 or number 6. But because of my love for dogs, because I am biased as hell with my love for dogs, I'm putting this as number 2. Go ahead, bring out the pitchforks, judge me all you want. Number 1, Leviathan the Lost. So of course this was going to be number 1, because guys, this is probably the biggest unanswered question and unsolved mystery when it comes to Final Fantasy XVI. And while it wasn't my number 1 unsolved mystery for a list I did a while back, it is still probably the most talked about missing content from Final Fantasy XVI throughout all the fans, and that is the fact that we don't know anything about Leviathan the Lost. Now, if you have no clue what I'm talking about, that is completely fine, because guess what? Leviathan the Lost was just mentioned barely in Final Fantasy XVI. As a matter of fact, there was only one scene where you can get the name Leviathan the Lost mentioned at all. Other than that, we don't see any kind of mention or talk about Leviathan the Lost. What we know about Leviathan comes from what we know about Final Fantasy as a lore. And that is the fact that Leviathan is normally a water-based, serpent-like creature throughout the Final Fantasy series. And since all the rest of the icons have been Final Fantasy summons throughout the series, it stands to reason that the Leviathan is going to be the same type of creature as we've seen before. And the perfect example is taking a look at Final Fantasy XV, the Leviathan summon. I feel like it's going to look very similar to that monster. That being said, all we know is that Leviathan has been lost, because that's what Joshua calls it, which means at some point in time, something happened with the dominant and the icon to where we don't know where this dominant has been all of this time. And there are so many different stories and theories out there surrounding who can be the dominant for Leviathan, because it doesn't seem likely that Square Enix is just going to leave that blank and never bring that up ever again. No, there's a reason why Square did this. I think one of the most popular theories that I really like is the fact that apparently it could be Etta's child. If you don't know who that is the character that is giving birth to a baby at the end of Final Fantasy XVI, mainly because Etta survived all the ether floods over Elude, while no one else could have survived that. Not even the bears survived that, and the only type of people that could survive those floods would be a dominant. So it would explain why Etta could have survived those floods, because there was a dominant inside of her. That's the biggest theory that I kind of go with. Another theory I really like as well, but I don't think is as true, is the fact that there is that potion girl who has no name and is really suspicious as to the fact why Square Enix hasn't gave her a name, but she has a hand in healing properties, and people say that water is associated with healing properties, so maybe that's somehow connected to Leviathan, since that is the water econ. Regardless of who Leviathan's dominant is, that is 100% going to come up in a DLC content. The question is how's that going to play out? Is it going to be a time jump to where we see the dominant of Leviathan doing something in the future and we see them all grown up? Maybe it's Etta's baby as an adult and they're fighting some kind of villain out there. Maybe Leviathan rescued Clive or Dion after the events of Final Fantasy XVI, and we can see that play out a little bit more. Or even if we just get a flashback and show how Leviathan the Lost became Leviathan the Lost. Show how Leviathan's dominant died and was for some reason never reborn into someone else. I don't know. Let me know in the comments, what do you think about Leviathan, and who do you think Leviathan is, and how is it going to play a part in the DLC if we get DLC for Final Fantasy XVI. But that does it for this episode of Nerd Space Games. Guys, hit up the comments to let me know your opinions in the comments below. What idea or concept do you think makes really good DLC content for Final Fantasy XVI? Anyways, if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button and hit the like button or dislike button if you enjoyed or hated this video, and share this video with your friends and family. And as always, I will see you on the next episode of Nerd Space. Take care.